So most of those fish we just looked at were the sunfish, and a lot of them were the black crappie, and bluegill, of course, are another very common sunfish species. They're all members of the same family, Centrarchidae. And sometimes, we know how to identify a fish, we know its name, we think, oh, I know that fish. But there's more to it than just a name. With fish, sometimes you look at a family of fish and it has some unexpected relatives. For example, the bass, largemouth bass and smallmouth bass are in this sunfish family. So they're very closely related, and the bass that we call bass, the largemouth and smallmouth bass, again, they're really sunfish, but the white perch is really a bass. It's in the temperate bass family, Moronidae, which includes the striped bass, which if you ever go down south, it's a real popular game fish in reservoirs and also on the East Coast with surf fishermen. The white perch, the white bass, and the striped bass are all members of that temperate bass family. And so, if we're talking about the bass that are in the sunfish family, we usually use the term black bass to differentiate that those are really the sunfish bass. By the same token, perch, again, white perch isn't really a perch. There's a lot of regional names for fish. Down south, crappies were called speckled perch, and green sunfish were called pool perch. So you had to learn whole different names for all the species you thought you already knew. But perch includes our yellow perch or lake perch. Of course, a really popular game and food fish around here. And also the walleye. The walleye is a perch as well, as are darters and log perch. Log perch are a really small striped fish that spend most of their time on the bottom. They're one of the darters. We have lots of darter species as well. The movements of these fish are a little different. The yellow perch do move between Lake Michigan and a lot of our very lower river areas. And places like Muskegon Lake and also the Grand River get migrations of these perch in from Lake Michigan primarily in the fall, and they'll stay through the winter, so people ice fish for them. They'll ice fish for Lake Michigan perch, but they'll do it in these river mouth areas. Perch don't like a lot of current, so they don't tend to run up to dams or anything. They'll only move inland a few miles, but it's a big movement of a lot of fish, especially when the perch populations were a little better than they are now. It was a really key fishery. And you'd also get movements in the middle of the summer from offshore in Lake Michigan up to the pier heads, right at the mouth of the river. That was a key fishery for them. And still, if you get the right conditions, we actually get upwellings of cold water in Lake Michigan when the wind blows right in the middle of the summer. And that will bring the perch in towards shore as that upwelling is kind of warming up after it's come in. So again, with fish, it's kind of all about timing. And some of the fish, the timing is a bit opposite of what you'd expect. This is a walleye caught in the Grand River, and the walleye fishing in the lower Grand here, tends to be best in summer. And you think of walleye as a spring migrant that spawns in rivers. They use the same kind of areas as the sucker do. They come in about the same time. But they did some tagging work in the Muskegon River, which has a lot of really good walleye spawning habitat up in the Muskegon. And a lot of the fish in the Grand actually go out to Lake Michigan and run up the Muskegon River when it's time to spawn. And some of those fish were caught as far north as Bays de Noc. From the Muskegon River, they travel all the way up there. So walleyes are big-time movers, and they are a fish that really benefits from all these connectivities. I don't have any studies to back it up, but I would bet that walleye, since they're a night feeder, they probably move into the backwaters to feed at night as well. I've caught walleye in other lakes, really shallow and weedy habitat that you would think of as bass areas, but they'll patrol those areas in the middle of the night and they'll pick off perch or little sunfish that are just sitting there asleep, not expecting a big walleye to come out from the main river or some deep water, which is where they tend to hang out in the day. Walleye have big eyes. They're really a fish that likes dirty water or darkness to feed it. It has an advantage over other predators. A more visual predator that really prefers clear water is the pike, which, if you consider the whole family of pike, it includes pike, muskie, and a couple species of pickerel, which are small. The muskie is a neat one to mention because the DNR is working on getting broodstock of our native Great Lakes muskie. The lower Grand and Muskegon and up and down the coast, we used to have these big spotted muskies here, and they disappeared through habitat changes and everything. They were always not the most common fish out there. Being a top predator, you know, you're never super abundant. We call the muskie the fish of 10,000 casts for a reason. They are very impressive, and they're important. You know, they're like the wolves of the water. People call the pike the water wolf, and its name is Essex lucius, after wolves. So they're really a phenomenal predator, and the muskie is their big cousin. So it would be interesting to see if we got these muskies back. Some people say, oh, we don't want a big predator around, and you know, people worry about them eating game fish. But if you consider the Grand, and you see some of the fish I pointed out, we have a tremendous diversity of fish. And people go out and they tend to catch bass and bluegill. But for every one bass out there, man, there might be 50 or 100 suckers. And not to mention the shad. The shad are incredibly abundant, and they're actually not native. I don't have a picture of a shad, but they start little, and they're good food when they're little. They kind of look like a little minnow, but by their first year, they're about this big, and there are a lot of shad out there that weigh a couple pounds. And there's not much out there that will eat a shad, except for big flathead catfish, or if we get them back, big muskie. So the hope is that by stocking muskie in the Grand, we'll do two things, well, three things really. We'll restore a native species, we'll provide a neat fishery for those who are hardy enough to go out there and try to fish for muskie, and we'll have a predator that's getting rid of fish that either don't get used by people or fish that are actually invasive, like the gizzard shad. And another thing to mention with these guys is they're wetland spawners. Pike tend to spawn even shallower than muskie, and pike will be affected by being cut off from their wetlands. And this isn't necessarily just building a levee. This can be just putting a culvert under a road. Pike are notorious for their aversion to culverts. They might have a good wetland area behind the new road, but if they have a culvert there, they won't necessarily go through it. So you can lose pike spawning habitat without filling in any wetlands or building any levees, just by not having good enough connectivity between environments. So pike, again, they're a visual feeder, so they're also affected by things that make the water more muddy. The siltation, the kind of muddiness we have in the Grand and in some of the bayous, will probably affect pike more than a lot of the other fish, because they're very much a visual predator that likes feeding when there's a fair amount of light around. And other fish will tend to do better if it's muddier. Things like catfish are great predators, really interesting native species again, but catfish are really swimming tongues. They're covered with taste buds. They have very well-adapted systems of sensing vibration in the water. So a catfish doesn't even need its eyes to eat. It knows where food is in a river. And it's really built for rivers, even more so than the pike. The pike are really built as more of a backwater species. And when you start seeing the backwaters get muddier and the habitat get a bit degraded, pike might be one of the early ones to go. So another native fish to mention that, like the suckers, has a bit of a stigma to it because its mouth's just a little bit down on its face. For some reason, we don't like anything that might possibly eat off the bottom. But these fish aren't even really strict bottom feeders. They'll feed suspended in the water column. You'll catch them trolling with spoons. People catch them all the time salmon fishing off the piers. And people call them sheephead, or less flattering names. But really they're freshwater drum. And if you know anything about the drum family, they're really a saltwater species. That's why we denote this one as freshwater drum. The other drum are red drum. You might know them as redfish, or on your plate as blackened redfish. The black drum, which looks just about like that when it's small, but it's over 50 to 60 pounds. I think the world record is about 110 for the black drum. It's a popular game fish. Croakers from down south in the Gulf area, the really common fish to catch in estuaries, they're another drum. And again, they look very similar to the sheephead. So a lot of these other drum are pretty popular fish, to the point where the red drum was fished down pretty hard, and they had to really clamp down on regulations to rebuild their populations. The freshwater drum, for some reason, really isn't very popular up here. It's fairly popular in Louisiana, but they call it gaspergoo, so you wouldn't even know it if you went to the fish market and saw them. Really, though, they're an okay fish to eat, especially when they're small. They're a fun fish to catch if you like catch and release. But they have another neat thing about them. They're really our native fish that's probably best adapted to dealing with a lot of the invasive species we have. I should have brought some in, but they have amazing throat molars, pharyngeal teeth, they have these crushing plates in the back of their throat, behind the gills, and they can just pulverize shells with those things. So they're built to take advantage of shellfish, and it probably has something to do with the fact that most of their relatives are from saltwater environments where mussels and such are pretty common. So they're good at eating mussels, and they're also good at eating gobies. So they're a fish that really keys in on what's near or on the bottom when it can, and it has this ability to feed almost anywhere if it needs to. And this is a unique fish too. It's really found mostly in areas that have these connections between the rivers and the lakes. If you look throughout their habitat, they're fairly widespread. They have a very big geographic range from Saskatchewan all the way down to Mexico. But the areas where they're abundant are places that have big lakes and big rivers that are connected, or places that are now artificially dammed up and have a big reservoir and then a big river coming in. So it's a neat fish, and they're so abundant down here that they tend to get a little bit of scorn from anglers who'd rather catch a walleye, but they're also a pretty interesting native fish that's really co-evolved with everything we have here and isn't really doing anything any harm. So with that, we'll look back at the river and everything that's connected to it, and hopefully you get kind of a better sense of just how fish that we have here are dependent on all those connections and all those different habitats that we have. You know, not even linked specifically to one habitat throughout their whole life, but the connections allow them to move from one area to another and really exploit the optimum habitat for each stage along the way. I think of even the fish that we don't think of as moving a lot, fish like bluegills and bass. They'll live for much of their life in those shallow, weedy environments that we expect to catch bluegill and bass. You know, they're kind of a pond fish. But the neat thing here is that in late summer, our backwater environments tend to get a little stagnant. You know, the weeds have grown up, and once those weeds grow up, we know weeds make oxygen. So, hey, that should be a good thing. But at night, they use oxygen. And throughout the night, they can drop that DO, the dissolved oxygen, pretty low, especially in really weedy areas, really eutrophic areas. So in an area that doesn't have connections to the river, you can get summer kills. You can get big die-offs of fish because that drops too far. Likewise, in the winter, if you get lots of ice cover in those same areas, you can get winter kills because of all the decomposition going on and no inputs through the snow-covered ice to replenish that oxygen. So I've seen some fish kills where there are disconnected oxbows right around here. Big fish kills where everything dies over the winter. The nice thing about these systems, though, is you get another flood, it fills up with fish again. And some of our connections here are year-round. So in a place like Bruce Bayou or Spring Lake, if things get a little nasty toward the end of summer, fish will just duck right out to the river. And I've even seen it where largemouth bass will get sick of being in the river. The water gets really hot, there might not be much food around, and they'll drop right out to the piers. You'll see, it was I think 2 years ago in the late summer, and there were just schools of largemouth bass patrolling the piers picking off gobies. And it may not have lasted for very long, but having that refuge, we call those areas refugia, and having some kind of temperature or oxygen refugia really helps fish out. Even if it's not a thing that's necessary, even if it just makes things a little more optimal for them, it's really nice to have that diversity of habitats available. Walleye are another one that is notorious for ducking out of the river, especially right around nightfall when they want to feed. They'll duck right out into the Lake Michigan kind of habitat gradient or ecotone, and they'll exploit that. They'll eat the fish that are right in that plume of water that's going into Lake Michigan. Because then they're getting not only the river fish, like the shad, that are kind of coming out and hanging around in that area, but also fish like alewife that are coming in from the colder water and hanging in those areas. So some people have keyed in on that, and walleye fishermen can do really well in late summer when the walleye are just right on that edge between the two habitats.